Now, moving on to some facts about the state of the grid and the state of affairs within our industry. These are covered in great detail on Power Trends, but I'm just going to hit a couple of the highlights that we think are important to note. When you look at the demand trends, and this is a historic view of what we see for demand or energy consumption within New York State. In the first several years of wholesale market operation, we saw a growing trend of consumption and demand, followed by what has been for about 10 years now a declining trend in the amount of demand on the system. This has been a function of both policy in the means of energy efficiency and consumer patterns, and also a function of some of the economic impacts of what we're seeing on industry within New York State. If we move forward and look at the forecast, and we spend a lot of time projecting what we think the future is going to look like, we see that while there's moderate growth in consumption, the actual baseline and the amount of demand that we see on the grid, we see continuing to decline over the next decade or so. And a lot of this, again, has to do with the increase of energy efficiency and also the growth of behind-the-meter resources, predominantly solar at this point, but those energy resources that sit behind consumer meters that reflect and serve to the demand of the customers and reduce the amount of demand that comes off the grid. Separate and distinct from looking at the amount of usage, we have to pay close attention to the peaks. And the reason that the peak is important is we design and operate our system to be able to serve load under all conditions. So we've got to be able to keep the lights on during the hottest day in the summer or the coldest day in the winter. But similarly, when we look at what the peak demand is, the impact of energy efficiency and behind-the-meter solar, we think will continue to flatten and slightly decrease the need for peaks as we move forward into this. Drilling down into some of the specific details, and this is a little bit newer in terms of how we've provided this information from our Power Trends in the past, but we've paid close attention to those newer technologies that we see onto the grid and understand how they impact our forecasts. One of the new technologies that we're putting some focus on is the introduction and penetration of electric vehicles onto the system. And this transformation from combustion engines to electric vehicles will serve to provide upward pressure on the demand that we see coming off the wholesale grid. And we anticipate that this will be very, very moderate to little impact in the first few years, but over time there's an opportunity that this could provide additional upward pressure. Interesting to note, specifically talking about the impact on the peak demand that I talked about previously, this has a much greater impact in the winter than it does in the summer. And this is related to due to the timing of the winter peak, which takes place in the evening after the sun goes down, and it's much more coincident with consumer charging cycles. So that's something that will affect our models into the future. Another new technology that we see that we're paying pretty close attention to is the introduction of more energy storage resources. And energy storage is going to impact our forecast in a much different way. Storage has the opportunity and the potential to be a very valuable resource on our grid, as it allows us to shift demand patterns to better accommodate serving that load. This is because storage has the ability to charge or replenish their energy capabilities when the load is low and prices are very low, and then be available as a resource later in the day to either offset some of the peak demand or serve some of the load. So the extent with which and the amount of storage that we see on the grid will play a major role in terms of how demand forecasts will need to be served in the future.